Welcome back. This is the Art of Storytelling Part 2. We focused on the principles and characteristics of storytelling in Part 1, and you can find that presentation on YouTube. But Part 2, we're going to focus on specific examples and kind of diagnose some of those examples. So we're going to start with political storytellers, and I want to start with Thomas Jefferson. So Thomas Jefferson's specific inclination in storytelling was to use the pen more often than the podium. So obviously he was president and he did give speeches and he was in front of people, but he was a very, very eloquent writer, and he was able to influence people through his writing much more often than through his speeches. One thing that is very interesting about Thomas Jefferson is his stance on slavery. Even though he owned slaves and never freed his own slaves, he constantly talked about abolishing slavery. He was the third president, so this was years before Abraham Lincoln would abolish slavery in the Civil War. So he constantly talked about this, and actually, cunningly, being the author of the Declaration of Independence, he had the foresight to not write anything about slaves in the Declaration of Independence, which made it easier for a future president, hence Abe Lincoln, to be able to make some type of correction to the Constitution, to the Declaration of Independence, that allowed for slaves to be freed. So very interesting that he had those thoughts, and that he was, even beforehand, was telling his story in kind of a covert way. But also interesting that he held his own slaves, and he was actually very prejudiced against African Americans. He wanted them to be free. He did believe that they should not be slaves, but he also wrote very specifically that once they were free, he believed that they should have to go back to their home nations, wherever they came from. He did not think that African Americans and European Americans, who were settlers, would be able to coexist. The next political storyteller we're going to talk about is Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln preferred actually telling stories, metaphors, to get his point across without actually saying what he wanted to do. He did this in public oftentimes, but he did it with his advisors, and he did it in very crucial times. One example was nearing the end of the Civil War. General Sherman came to him and asked whether the army should pursue and capture Jefferson Davis of the South. Lincoln did not want this to happen, yet he could not publicly declare it because the North, many of the public, wanted Jefferson Davis caught. But being the politician that he was, he did not want to violently capture him. So he turned to Sherman and his advisors and said, "That reminds me of a story." And he related a tale about a man who had taken a pledge against drinking. The man, said Lincoln, was offered a drink at a friend's house. The man declined on account of his pledge, so his friend offered him lemonade instead. The host then mentioned that the lemonade would be a bit more palatable if he were to pour some brandy in it. The man said that if his host were to do that, unbeknownst to him, then he could not object. Sherman immediately grasped the meaning of Lincoln's story. The army was to conveniently let Jefferson Davis escape without the president's knowledge. A very clever way of using a story to tell and persuade others and not having to come out in public and do it. The next political storyteller we're going to talk about is probably the best storyteller of all time, Adolf Hitler. Hitler's skills in storytelling are amazing for a couple reasons. First, because he started by writing down his stories in Mein Kampf when he was in jail. And he used that medium, right? We would talk about the medium in the audience. That was his introduction to his audience, was through his book. And the way, if you've ever been able to read any of it, the way that he was able to relate to the plight of the average German and endeared himself to them as a leader. And then he transitioned from that medium to his over 5,000 speeches he gave, coming up to become chancellor and growing the Nazi Party. He would work tirelessly on writing his speeches and then also practicing his speeches on how he was going to give them with his charismatic emphasis and all of his gestures and body language. So he knew the power of it. He knew that being a skilled writer wasn't going to be the only thing that got him where he needed to be. He needed to be a skilled orator. He actually wrote that and said that all of the greatest leaders in the world were all great orators, the ones who actually changed the world. And also, if you listen to his speeches or read some of his speeches, the amount of outright hate speech that you're going to find is not there. It's not what you don't immediately come away feeling that you're under the thumb of the devil. He positions himself as the one who is in defense. He is being very defensive. All of these things are happening from outside forces that are forcing his hand, whether they be from the west or whether they be from the east. But all of these outside presences are forcing Germany's hand, and he has to do the things he has to do. And he's doing them for the German people to protect them. So a much different story. I mean, if I sat down and just gave you a script about it and didn't tell you who it was from and you didn't know the narrative, you would be reading it in a completely different light. So it's just very interesting the way that he was able to spin the story, for sure. The next political storyteller that I want to discuss is JFK. JFK's interesting aspect to storytelling is the camera. So video and live TV had become humongous, and TVs were now in most households when JFK became popular running for president. And so he used this medium to spin stories to his audience. And he's able to do this without even sometimes speaking, without even sometimes writing anything down. The videos tell the story. So JFK was the youngest president that we've ever had, and his young family, his 2 young children and his young beautiful wife, the way that the video fell on them at that point made them seem as though we were coming out of the end of this World War II horribleness, and he was something new and a breath of fresh air. And that's the story that was imparted on his audience. And for sure, he was also a good speaker and a good writer. But I think the most important part of his political storytelling comes from the video aspect of it. Now we're going to move into talking about religious storytellers. So the first storyteller that we're going to talk about is Mohammed. So the Prophet Mohammed, the leader of the Islamic faith, he had an interesting medium for which his storytelling capabilities began. So he would go to a cave and have visions, dreams, experiences with angels, whatever you want to call them, and would come back and recite what would happen. And then his audience was many of the townspeople in Mecca, that's where he would go back to, were kind of under the thumb of ruling class families. And so it kind of started with him going to these people who were under the thumb of the ruling class families and saying, the current religion of 365 gods is wrong, and there is one God. And that's how the visions started, and he would go to the cave for more visions and more guidance. And throughout the rest of his life, decades, he would continue to have visions, and the visions would become very specific. And he would write down laws and go to war and decide that you can have more than one wife if you were a capable man, and a lot of different interpretations, and some things shifted based on things that happened, and there's still some kind of gray area in some of the visions, but just interestingly, in the storytelling capacity of it, the using of visions during that time, which was obviously much more accepted than it would be now, and then common to many leaders like Hitler, who spoke to the deprived class of Germany. He kind of spoke to this class that was waning for some type of different religion or different hope that they could rely on. The next political storyteller we're going to talk about is Gandhi. And one of the most important aspects of Gandhi is his principle of nonviolence. And the ability that Gandhi had to tell his story was through example. He was many times viciously beaten, and his followers and people around him saw this, and that helped tell the story that he was legitimate in his beliefs. And the boycotts that he held, he talked about creating your own cotton. Every Indian should create their own cotton so they weren't dependent on Britain. And similarly with the salt trade, he did all these things by example. Yes, he could talk in front of massive groups in a very persuasive manner. He definitely wasn't as emotional as like a Hitler, but he was a persuasive. But part of his persuasion in his storytelling came from the fact that he was exemplifying that behavior, that self-sacrificial behavior that got him in painful situations and jailed for 7 years of his life. So that's how he was able to tell stories. Another religious storyteller that I want to talk about is Jim Jones and the cult that he created. Jim Jones was an exceptional leader in taking advantage of his audience. So we talked about that as far as the principles of really good storytelling. And what happened was, during the civil rights movement, many churches, especially in states, southern states and Indiana, where he's from, wanted to stay segregated. And he preached a message of inclusion. And he said, no, this isn't a place for that, and that everybody should be welcome into the house of God. And so he was able to get some extremely devoted followers, because what he initially was preaching was beyond its time and was very almost saintly, right? I mean, we all believe in this integration and this equality of people now. Back then, that belief wasn't there. So he started with a principle that was a very, very good principle, but then once he was able to get this level of extreme devotion, because people believed in him, they're like, I hate the outside. Once they believed in the in the internal message, he was able to adapt it and change it and be able to control his followers. And obviously got into crazy situations where he moved his church to San Francisco, and then he moved it down out of the country in South America, and then even, obviously, we know the story, he murdered a congressman who came to try and disband his entire cult. So very, very, very interesting in how he was able to spin the stories. It started out something so innocent and turned into something so grave.